Bending the arc of human potential. What stigma got to do with it? Psychologists define structural stigma as the societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional policies that constrain the opportunities, resources, and well-being of the stigmatized. Stigmatized groups often experience scarcity, not only of material resources, but fundamentally scarcity of positive regard, which can threaten physical as well as psychological safety. We've seen the lethal consequences of the stigma known as racism repeatedly this summer. Social scientists have shown that cognitive bandwidth, i.e. problem-solving capacity, is compromised by scarcity, compromised by stigma. The oppressive nature of racial stigma is toxic, metaphorically and literally. It makes it hard to breathe. Yet research has also shown that psychologically based interventions can reduce the bandwidth tax that stigmatized students are paying and improve academic performance. What should we do differently to allow stigmatized students to thrive in educational settings and to be able to demonstrate fully what they know and can do? That's what this session is about. I am Beverly Daniel Tatum, your moderator, and I am joined by Dr. Geoff Cohen, James G. March Professor in Organization Studies in Education and Business, Professor of Psychology and Organizational Behavior in the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Dr. Sia Verschelden, recently retired as Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs at Malcolm X College, one of the city colleges of Chicago. Her book, Bandwidth Recovery, Helping Students Reclaim Cognitive Resources Lost to Poverty, Racism, and Social Marginalization, was published in 2017. Her new book, Bandwidth Recovery for Schools, Helping Pre-K-12 Students Regain Cognitive Resources Lost to Poverty, Trauma, Racism, and Social Marginalization, is expected any day now from Stylus Publishing. Sia, let's start with you. Tell us what you mean by bandwidth recovery.
Thanks, Beverly. I've been working on something that I call bandwidth, and it's the cognitive resources or the attentional resources. It's the part of our brain over which we have conscious control. And I think of my bandwidth as being about the width of my head. So this is what we have to work with, to learn, to work, to develop. And I've written about the ways that poverty, racism, classism, xenophobia, homophobia, childhood trauma, all these things and other aspects of difference deplete the cognitive resources of students in some groups. So what I'm saying is that when students are worried about money, or they don't have enough to eat, or they don't have a safe place to live, or they're targets of microaggressions, or they're worrying about being accepted with all their identities in their classroom, or they're fearful for their safety, that part of their brain that's worried about those things is not available for learning. And all of these things fundamentally are about uncertainty. Will I be safe? Will I be loved? Will I belong? Will I be treated fairly? And now, so all of that already existed before the pandemic. And I would suggest now that uncertainty is blown up for all of us. So all of us have uncertainty between the pandemic and the social unrest around state violence toward Black people, that we all have uncertainty. And so that many of us, students and their teachers, and all of us listening, I'm sure, are coming into the learning environment at all levels with depleted bandwidth to learn and to thrive. And certainly, though it's not equally distributed, people in some groups, because of their social identities, because of their economic well-being, because of their health, wealth, income, have a greater bandwidth tax from uncertainty than others.
So thank you. We're going to come back to this idea of bandwidth tax and bandwidth recovery and how we actually can facilitate that. But I want to let Geoff get in on the conversation too. Geoff, as a social psychologist, I know you've been researching the effect of stigmatization, social identities, how those interact in one way or another for a long time. And I've heard you also talk about this term, belonging uncertainty. So can you tell me a little bit about what that means to you relative to the work that you've been doing?
Yes, thank you so much. Belonging uncertainty is it refers to a phenomenon or a psychological experience we have when we're working in a situation or entering a situation where we feel uncertain about how we're regarded, whether we're viewed positively, whether we're seen as someone who has value or worth. There's an uncertainty. We're not sure how we're seen. We might be regarded favorably, we might not. But there's a hypothesis in our minds about the possibility that we could be seen or demeaned in light of, especially often in light of a group to which we belong. The idea for belonging uncertainty came out of some research that my colleague Greg Walton and I did years and years ago, which was premised on this idea that one of the things that we often ask ourselves in any achievement situation we're in any situation where we're kind of deciding whether to invest ourselves or not, is, do I belong here? Is this a place where I want to belong? Is this a place where I could kind of fit in, where I can trust people, where they will accept me? And so it's like a question of belonging that we're kind of constantly asking ourselves, especially as we step into a new domain. It could be a new sport, a new endeavor. Maybe I'm going into business or becoming an entrepreneur or starting my first year of college. We're always asking this question. It's the kind of part of our human nature to ask the question, is this a place and is this a group of people where I feel like I can belong? Now, the idea that Greg and I explored that kind of dovetails with what you and Sia have already introduced is this idea that that question of belonging is a lot louder if I'm a member of a stereotype group, a group that's sort of socially marginalized throughout society. That means that, say, if I'm an African American stepping into a college campus for the first time, not only do I have all the questions about, can I make it here? Is this a place or a home for me that other students have, but I also have this additional source of uncertainty, which is, will I be excluded from positive relationships because of the group to which I belong, because of the stereotype about me and my group? The stereotype is sort of out there in the air, and I know that it could taint the hearts and minds of other people beyond the boundary of my group. And so I'm just kind of a bit more vigilant, and that vigilance is what we refer to as belonging uncertainty.
And that vigilance takes up bandwidth, right? You're using up some of your attentional resources because you're trying to figure out what's safe for me, who can I trust? How is that working? And particularly in a climate where we are seeing so much, particularly right now, anti-Black racism in the context of what's happening, with the police and other situations. Of course, this is not specific to Black people. It's also any marginalized group. Stigmatization could be in terms of sexual orientation or other forms of identity, religious identity, socioeconomic status. But particularly in the context of racism, we see a very virulent kind of stigmatization occurring. Sia, when you talk about strategies, which you have written about in your book, Bandwidth Recovery, what kinds of things have you seen be effective in classrooms and other learnings that help students settle down this question of uncertainty, belonging uncertainty, and reclaim some of that bandwidth?
Well, that's a very good question, of course. One of the things is, I want to say just up front that strangely enough, and if you hear me talk about this, and if you read the first half of my book, there's all these things that steal bandwidth. But this bandwidth perspective is a strengths perspective rather than a deficit perspective, because what I'm saying is students are smart enough. It's not about how smart they are, but if they're coming in with this much of their bandwidth because they are wearing lots of masks because they don't feel like they can be their true self in the classroom, or whatever the things is, or we can have brilliant teaching, online or offline, doesn't matter. But if students are coming in with this much bandwidth, they're not going to learn very much. So it's a strengths perspective in the sense that we just have to figure out how to create environments where they can get their bandwidth back. So some of those things, the first thing, really a strengths perspective, is related to this sense of funds of knowledge. This term comes out of early childhood education, actually, but the fact that students are coming to our learning environments in colleges with lots of knowledge, skills, abilities that they've learned from their home, their culture, their neighborhood, their work. Many students have worked since they were in high school, early in high school. And we mostly focus on what students don't have. If they don't read well enough, they don't write well enough, etc. So assuming they're bringing a bunch and then leveraging that. So starting out with what are you bringing to the table? So that involves hearing people. So some of the things are to make sure every student is truly heard. And we can, this Zoom environment is interesting because we can have what I refer to when I wrote about elementary and high school, have a policy, every voice, every day. And we can do that in a classroom on Zoom. Have everybody's voice is heard. And some maybe they weren't in the classroom. We can provide for students basic needs. People can't, Michael Sorrell said yesterday, the title of his talk was, "What does research matter if our students can't eat or breathe?" So we know if students are thinking about their bellies because they're hungry, that's a big chunk of their brain, their bandwidth's not available for learning. And for instance, in Houston, Texas, after, Hurricane Harvey, they realized how important school was to feeding people. And now, I think it's still going on, all the kids in Houston public schools get lunch every day and breakfast. They don't have to fill out forms. Everybody just gets food because people can't learn if they're hungry, and that higher ed as well. We can create learning environments where everybody's safe to be all their identities, whatever that is, because we know that most of diverse identities can't be seen. We can tell that you're Black and I'm white, but most of the diversity, of course, is things that can't be seen. But everybody has to be able to take off all the masks and be their whole self in the classroom and out of the classroom. We can establish classroom cultures where, for instance, we agree that microaggressions will be confronted in a civil and calm manner. So microaggressions are little things we say to each other that might be racist or sexist or homophobic. Lots of times we're unaware of them because we're just ignorant. We're trying to relate, we don't know. We can establish an environment where we say, we're gonna say, oh, that hurt. That was one of those things, so we can learn. We can make schools inside and outside classrooms identity safe environments that Claude Steele talks about. So look around our schools. This, for school leaders listening, is the cheapest thing you can do. Walk around your school and look at whose pictures are on the walls, who's represented, who counts. And a lot of our schools, because higher ed in the United States is a middle and upper class white endeavor historically, and I would suggest still, there's a lot of old white guys' pictures hanging on the wall of the presidents forever. We don't need to apologize for that. That's the way it is. But we have to make sure the students who are at our schools see their pictures. And we need to make sure, well, we're working on it slowly, that they see themselves in front of the classroom. They see somebody who looks like them, shares some identity with them in front of the classroom, which for many Black and brown students, they can go through their whole education and very rarely see Black and brown people in front of the classroom. I'm gonna stop there. I know Jeff has some things to contribute.
Great, well, thank you. So as you were talking about, those feeling able to bring in your whole identity, be who you are and feel recognized and accepted for that. Of course, that comes back to some of the things that I know Jeff have written about in terms of students questioning whether they can really trust that that's going to be okay, as you said in your opening statement. So I'm wondering if you could share some of those strategies that you've seen, through the research that you've done to be effective for reassuring students that they can trust the environment that they're in and the faculty that they're working with.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, this will just elaborate a bit on what Sia's already said, because I think the spirit and content of what she said really dovetails very well with the research we've done on belonging uncertainty and ways to lessen it. Maybe I'll just start by pulling the camera back a little bit and just make the point that what all these approaches share in common is that we're trying to change the situation, the kind of social situation that kids and students, users are in. And that's a pretty radical idea. It's easy kind of to miss. I think most of the time in our culture, we are very, very fixated on changing attitudes and beliefs and aptitudes and abilities, all these kind of internal essences that we think are inside of students. My colleague Lee Ross has a term for this called fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error. It just refers to our tendency to think that all the complexity of behavior basically is due to personality and character, these kind of internal essences inside of people. And we neglect the power of the situation, the social situation we're in. So all the strategies that Sia was talking about really have that as their underlying philosophies, that if we could change this, if we can change the situation, we can change a lot, maybe even everything. And there is so much great evidence showing the power of the situation. So even in a harsh world that we're living in, right, this harsh, where discrimination and violence and anti-Blackness and racism and sexism are a reality and need to be addressed. That's a top priority for us as a society. Even in that context, within a classroom, or even within a relationship, or even within just an encounter, we can create a space where those things are kind of, it's almost like opening an umbrella, kind of you're temporarily protected from them. So let me just give an example from one of our lines of research of this. There's this thing that we do all the time in education, all the time in life, which is to give people feedback, critical feedback on ways in which they can do better. So my colleagues Claude Steele and Lee Ross and David Yeager and I did several of these studies where we looked at how people, African-American students and white students, react to critical feedback from a white teacher. And this is at the college age, the middle school age, for students. And what we found is that when given pretty much the same feedback, African-American students tended to respond less positively from it when they thought it was coming from a white teacher. They suspected that maybe it's a little biased against me. This is sort of critical feedback. And they felt less motivated to try again. And the reason why was because there's this situation, given that stereotypes exist and I could be judged in light of them in this situation, I have to entertain the possibility that maybe this feedback is biased against me. And that's something that the white students by and large don't have to contend with. So that's a kind of belonging uncertainty. I'm just uncertainty. Is the stereotype being used here in this interaction? So looking at that situation as a teacher, you see Blacks less motivated than whites in response to critical feedback. You might say, you might commit the fundamental attribution error. You might say, maybe the Blacks are less motivated. Maybe they don't care as much about school. But in reality, that's not the issue. It's this kind of invisible situation that they're in that we can't quite see. It's unfolding behind their eyes. And you can change the situation in very small ways to make that situation go more smoothly for them. So, for example, one thing that we did was to have, for another group of kids, when they got the same criticism from their teacher, the teacher said up front, look, I'm going to give you some critical feedback, but the only reason I'm giving you this criticism is because I have high standards. And based on what I've seen in your work, I believe in your potential to reach them. And then the criticism followed. What that does is like opening an umbrella. You kind of create a kind of microcosm where, okay, the kid knows, hey, the stereotype doesn't apply here. I can take the feedback at face value. This person obviously believes in me, even changes the frame of the criticism. So now it's like a positive rather than a negative. And what we find is that under those conditions, African-American students respond as positively, if actually a little bit more positively to the criticism than white students. And they end up doing the next year, as a result of that single bit of feedback, much better academically. They get in less trouble academically. And so there seems to be a way in which a kind of power to the situation that we can harness. And it boils down to creating these spaces in the classroom of varying duration where kids feel like, okay, this is a place where I belong. These kind of harmful cultural messages that are out there beyond these walls are for a moment shuttered out.
That's a great example. Thank you very much for sharing that. One of the things that I know about your work, this is a follow-up question, and then I'm coming back to Sia, is that it's not only the kind of intervention like you just described, but it's also the timing of the intervention that makes a difference. Could you just say a word about that situation crafting and the timeliness of it as it relates to its effect?
Yeah, the term where I'm writing a book on this now, this idea that you can craft situations to promote people's belonging. We have this term that you just used, situation crafting, in which the idea is that by crafting situations, you can kind of unleash people's potential. And there's some basic guidelines for situation crafting. One is crafting the situation so that these harmful messages are cut off. That's the example I just gave of this kind of criticism, positive criticism. Another key guideline is timeliness. So it's not just getting a message, it's getting a message at the right time that can make all the difference. And I think we all know this in our personal lives. Like there are just these moments where just a well-timed pat on the back goes a very long way. And it's because it came at the right time that it works. So we find this to be the case too in some of the experiments that we've done. These are all experimental studies with wise criticism, to give an example, works best at the transition to kind of more difficult environments where the standards suddenly shift upward, like the kids are going into middle school or to high school or to college, and all of a sudden it's like, why am I getting so much critical feedback? That's a moment where clarifying the meaning of the criticism can go a long way. Then just to give one more quick example, we've done some work on what are called self-affirmations, which goes back to Sia's point of creating classrooms where people feel like their whole self is heard. So one of the techniques for doing this is known as self-affirmation, wherein you give students the opportunity at stressful moments to reflect on core values that they hold. So the kids might, before taking a test, write about their relationships or something important to them, like their religion. And what that does is it kind of pulls the lens back. It kind of gives people a psychological timeout to kind of recenter themselves on what's really important, what makes them a whole self. And we find in numerous studies with Claude Steele that this small act, though small, is potent in that it gives people a kind of resiliency to deal with the stressor, and they're more likely to perform well on tests and do well in school. So that technique of values affirmation, we find, well, you know, timeliness is everything. You give it to people when they're like vacationing somewhere, it doesn't have any impact. But you give it to them right before they're about to give that difficult speech, you know, that, you know, where they could make it, everything's at stake, and they know it. Give it to them right before that, and it can have a even life transformative effect. So timing is important. Timeliness to the moment of stress where people feel threatened, but there's opportunity. And that probably distills a lot of the wisdom, is timeliness with respect to both psychological threat and opportunity is critical.
That's great, thank you. Sia, you know, listening to Jeff and having had the opportunity to read not only Bandwidth Recovery in the first iteration, but also having seen a preview copy of Bandwidth for Recovery for Schools, which is soon to be widely available. I know that you think a lot about not just the individual interaction, but the institutional response. And of course, that was part of your responsibility as a college administrator. When we think about the importance of social belonging and the power of stigma, knowing that it can erode one's sense of belonging and impact bandwidth, what does that tell us about how we should try to change systems, how we should try to change institutions? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, and I wanted to follow up on what Jeff was saying, what he's describing, and I use this to talk about this values affirmation thing quite often and do it with lots of people. The wonderful thing about what Jeff's talking about, this idea of situation crafting, is all these things we're talking about are social constructs in the first place. Like what a classroom looks like, who's in the front of the classroom, where are the students sitting, what a school looks like. All these are social constructs, which means we made them, people made them. Which means the downside of that is, like racism is a social construct. Race is a social construct. It isn't real. We made that up. Racism is real, and it's so dug in our culture. However, the hope is we can deconstruct it and we can build something else. So what schools, when I've been thinking about this so much about why school doesn't work for millions of people, is because we created school in this country, well, higher education certainly, for single white men who came from rich or at least middle class families. And there's a whole structure around that with the teacher in the front with all the power and the students sitting in the seats. And I think we've kind of grudgingly over centuries let other people in to this, girls and women and people of color and poor people, but we fundamentally not changed the construct. So I think we need to look at what are we doing and what a nice time to do it, because everything's up in the air. So I think we have to realize some students need more help to buttress them, because not as much is coming from home because of economic inequality and 1,000 other things. And people don't have as much bandwidth. We need to look at the digital divide. And we could decide as a country, for instance, to say everybody has internet access, like they have water. Not everybody has water. If you go to the Navajo reservation, you find out most people have running water. That's accepted. Electricity, gas service. We could decide everybody has internet. We could decide everybody at school gets food because you need food to learn. We could make some of these changes in the schools and really examine everything we do in every school at every level. Who does it advantage? Who is disadvantaged by this? Whose culture is this upholding? And look at each one of those things and take them apart if they don't serve the needs of the students who are there now. That's a big order of it.
Thank you. You know, we have an opportunity for listeners to ask questions. I'm told so far we don't have any questions that have been posed yet. So I am thinking that people are so engaged in the examples you've given that their wheels are spinning. So I'm going to invite listeners to post questions in the chat, because this is a great opportunity to hear from both Jeff and Sia. But in the meantime, I've got plenty of questions. And I'm happy to say that I've had the chance to read both of your work. I know, Jeff, that you're working on a new book. And in that new book, you're going to be focusing on this issue of belonging. But I'm wondering if there are points from your latest work that you want to lift up in the context of this conversation, particularly thinking about how we should try to change educational systems to mitigate some of the impact of belonging uncertainty.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking that when Sia was talking, that I agree that we need, as institutions and society and systems, to kind of look at these, you know, obvious but also not so obvious situations that we've constructed and ask the question: is this advantaging one group or one set of individuals? Is it disadvantaging another? And I think that's a really helpful lens, just thinking about these things we take for granted in our environments, our social environments, that might not be so healthy for some groups. And that could range from some of the obvious, like entering a department or a school where, as you see as example, shows where all the pictures are of white men. And we know that from research that can be a pretty alienating experience if you're not a white male to kind of enter into an environment like that with that kind of cue. Like we're very, in a state of belonging and certainty, we're especially sensitive to these kinds of cues. We know that. And more, other obvious examples include getting, cracking down on racism, discrimination, which we know still happens in the classroom and in the workplace. So eliminating discriminative policies. I just was reading one example in research on hiring practices, which showed that, this is by Diva Pager, showing that the kind of market penalty for being Black in the labor employment sector is about equal to the penalty of having a prison record in terms of your likelihood of getting a call back. So those are kind of no-brainers, right? Kind of creating situations that cut down or crack down on discrimination somehow, kind of creating practices that support more egalitarian decisions. What I also think is sometimes easy to miss, but just as important, is these kind of subtle things that happen in our environments that we often just are missing all the time, that end up disadvantaging or excluding some individual, or in ways that we just don't really realize. And I think I'd just make a pitch for that, like experimenting, trying different things that we think, kind of going off script a little bit, can actually be eye-opening. And just to give you like one example of that, this is one of my favorite examples. Elliot Aronson, back in 1971, was really interested in creating classrooms, integrated classrooms in elementary and high schools that were more equitable, where Black and Latino kids would have equal opportunity to white students. And this was in the aftermath of desegregation. The schools were trying to integrate, but what he was finding, or what a lot of people were finding, is that there were these huge racial achievement gaps opening up in these integrated schools. And so what he did was to just go into the school with his students as observers and just watch what was unfolding. How was this disadvantage being created? And kind of naively, you might say, well, maybe the Black kids are just underprepared and they just don't have the ability. That would be the fundamental attribution error. But what he found is that there was a subtle dynamic in the classroom that put the minority kids at a consistent disadvantage. And that subtle dynamic was kind of zero-sum competitiveness. There was this kind of zero-sum competitiveness in the classroom. And it would unfold something like this. The teacher would ask a question, like, what were the names of the ships that Christopher Columbus sailed in? And then instantly, all the kids would raise their hand, vying for the kind of scarce resource of the teacher's approval. And usually, and then the teacher would call on one of the kids and everyone else would groan and get really excited if that kid got it wrong. And what ended up happening is that this competitive situation really put the minority kids at a disadvantage because they didn't first feel like they belonged, and they'd often gone to inferior schools, so that knowledge wasn't kind of either there or just primed and ready. So they were just falling further behind in this kind of competitive situation. So the teachers look like, this is just school. It's like nothing, there's no racism here. But the competitive structure actually instantiated and reified the racial achievement gap. So what he did was to experiment. It's like, let's flip the script. Let's create a more cooperative classroom. And he created what's called the jigsaw classroom. And basically, long story short, he puts kids in these kind of cooperative clusters where each of them has a kind of piece of the larger lesson plan to learn and then contribute to the larger group. And found that has enormous benefits for minority students, helps to close achievement gaps, and even reduce prejudice among the white kids. So that's just like kind of just trying to kind of provide some connective tissue here. That's just one big idea here, is that sometimes the ways in which our social reality is biasing one group or another, it can be very, very hard to see.
You know, you were talking about social cues and the ways in which those cues trigger responses. And I was thinking about actually an example I heard from a student, first-year student, African-American, at a flagship state university. where there had been, and I'll name the university because I mentioned this example in my book where all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, University of Michigan, and it happened in the spring, in the fall of 2016. There had been, it was the election season as it is now, and there had been a lot of posters put up by some white supremacist groups questioning the legitimacy of the presence of Black students at the University of Michigan. Now it appeared to not be something done by, nobody knew who was putting the posters up actually, but they were around the campus in the environment. And this student would see the posters basically challenging whether she belonged at the university, and then go into, she was taking a geology class or something like that. And she said, the professor's talking about all these different kinds of rocks. I can't pay attention to the rocks. I'm wondering who in my class might have put up those posters. Like the psychological safety of the experience was quite challenging for her. It was definitely taking up cognitive bandwidth. She definitely felt distracted. And in that context, she also felt like there was there weren't very many places she could talk about this. But this particular student was living in a housing situation, a multiracial housing community, which was intentionally multiracial. And as part of the experience, there was a intergroup dialogue dimension where the kids were encouraged to talk to each other about difficult topics. And one of the things she said really helped her about living in that environment was that she trusted that she could talk about this experience with her suite mates, even though they weren't necessarily her same background. There were people in her living environment she could talk to, and that was helpful. So as I listened to both you and Sia talk about, what makes a difference, you can, on the one hand, see the cues, the negative cues and the threat of that, but you can also see the support that came from being able to talk about it, to feel heard, to feel seen, to feel understood in the living environment. And just using this as an example, I'm wondering, Sia, as someone who's worked as an administrator, what can you tell us about how interventions like maybe that housing experience, that residential community that is designed to be supportive in that way, or other strategies might help? And also, I'm just thinking about the geology professor. What could the geology professor have done in that learning environment that might have been reassuring to that student, even though it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with geology?
Oh, so many things are running through my head. And I go back to Jeff saying, cut out the harmful messages. I wrote that down. One of the things that I encourage, and I know some of the faculty of Malcolm X do this. And Malcolm X is a school on the west side of Chicago, 95% Black and Hispanic students. She does a check-in, and I'm really encouraging check-ins. And the Zoom environment, again, is very good for this. So a check-in at the beginning of class is everybody, this friend of mine does, every student speaks. You can say one sentence up to 3 sentences. And it's just, how are you doing today? So you can, a lot of times it's a good thing. My baby had her first birthday yesterday, or, whatever. Could be something bad, and then you spend some time with support. But something Jeff made me think about this is, once you say those words out loud, so if this uncertainty, this sense of, I'm not sure I belong here, if you can say those things, or I'm having, or, it could be something, my grandmother's sick from COVID, for instance, and I'm worried about that. Once you voice those, I picture you can kind of set them aside for the 50 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes of class. The geology professor can't take that away from her, that she's a Black student faced with these posters. But you can acknowledge them, you can set them down. The student knows I have support from this group. And you can't do that in a class with 400 students, of course, but on Zoom, you could do it in breakout groups. So you actually could do it. So share, set those aside. And I've had many people say, well, I can't do that. I have too much material to cover. I can't afford that time. But the thing is, if the student's worried about those posters, or if the student's hungry, or if the student's brother just got shot last night, they're not learning anything anyway. So you can have 5 minutes of check-in, or even 10 minutes of check-in in a 50-minute class and get more learning done in the last 40 minutes than if you pretend like everybody's coming in with all their bandwidth. Some of the students will get your whole 50 minutes. A lot of them will get 40% of it because 60% of their bandwidth is worried about something else. And that's true for actually all of us,
Yes.
especially now. And many of us, I know the bandwidth tax for Black faculty and staff. They're exhausted. I mean, you know this, people are tapped out. So even in our own colleague situations, let's not pretend everybody's coming in with the same bandwidth. I think this acknowledgement that there are bandwidth issues can be huge for students. And this is back to the social construct idea, but what is really nice, and Beverly, you said it, it's really discouraging that these things exist that are negative, but we, and Jeff described, we can do some fairly simple things to increase bandwidth, to increase a sense of belonging that don't cost a lot of money, that can, I think, actually make a big difference. So it doesn't have to be transformational and lots of money.
I'm getting that signal that lets me know we're almost out of time. So I'm gonna invite Jeff, I'm gonna invite you, and Sia, if we have time, I'll come back to you. I'm not sure we will. 2 minutes, I'm told. For just closing thoughts. Are there points as you think about how we empower educators to really impact? Someone said you can't you can't carpet the world for students, but you can help them put on shoes, right? What can we do to try to help make sure that students are going to be able to demonstrate at their best what they've learned, what they know, what they can do, even in a stigmatizing world? Jeff, closing thoughts?
I hearing both of you talk. I think one of the things I've thought about, I've thought of as I heard you talk, was this idea of social support in the psychological literature, the power of social support. So there's a lot of research out there just showing, like, as social species, we get a lot of resiliency from other people, feeling like we belong, feeling like we're part of community, feeling like someone has our back. And so kind of one of the things we're all talking about here is the power of social support. We're like the example you gave, Beverly, of the suite mate who just heard the student have this issue. There's a power to that, even though other people,